going to be to build more transit. And in order to build more transit, to fight congestion, we have to lay out how we're going to pay for it. There are those who would say just raise property taxes. And I ran on and achieved this office on keeping property taxes low. And you saw in the city's own report that when it comes to financing multi-billion-dollar projects for transit and housing and other things, that report coincides with my own belief that property taxes are not an appropriate way in which to do that. There are others who say sell hydro. And I don't agree that is the right way to go, and I'm not going to do that either. But doing nothing is not an option. Building transit, building housing, refurbishing our roads is not free. It has a big price tag to it, and it is a price tag that a number of you have said to me over time, quite correctly, we have to address. I said I would, and I have done so. And I would say to anybody who is going to be critical of this, and I understand there are going to be differing opinions across the city from many different people, but they have an obligation, in my view, to stand up and to say how they would pay for the transit, or to acknowledge they're just not going to build the transit. And if that's somebody's position, that's fine. I don't happen to believe that's responsible or right for a growing great city, but somebody might hold that point of view. The other thing we know is that 40% of the people who use the roads that I would propose to toll are people who do not live in our city and do not pay taxes here. And I think that to ask them to pay a small share, a fairer share, certainly anything is fairer than nothing, of the cost of rebuilding and maintaining those roads and the transit that gives them, too, an option to get to and from Toronto in a different way is also a fair thing to do. And so now I will answer your questions. And let's try and keep it somewhat orderly. I don't know how we do that without these lists, but let's just go around.
I think that someone needs to remind you of that time more than a decade ago when you called road tolling a highway robbery. Can you figure out some way to bring those two notions together? You're a strong proponent now. You made a funny website now. What's changed for you?
13 years ago, the main thing that's changed is I wasn't the mayor and didn't have this responsibility. And I do now have this responsibility and had three choices in front of me as to how we could pay for the transit. Three options, basically. Option one, dramatically and massively raise property taxes to pay for multi-billion-dollar projects. Option two, sell assets that could only be sold once and that would produce a certain amount of money one time. And option three was to use other means of revenue and to try and to collect that money to build the transit and fix the traffic. And I think I've outlined the reasons why we took some of the available revenue options that are covered in the city staff report and picked the one that we did. And I am going to take this plan forward to City Council and to the people as the best and fairest way at this time in 2016 and beyond to collect the money we need to build the transit we need so that we can have the kind of city that we want in the future.
How this would work? How do you foresee this working as far as transponders?
I would hope that we will be able to have the most technologically advanced system in the world. Having just come back from Israel, where they've developed all kinds of different applications that involve traffic, and just looking at some of the work that's being done here in Toronto, there are very advanced systems that are in development, that are in use as experiments, and I would hope that by the time we actually get to procure the technology, we can do something that's very advanced, very convenient. I was being told just before lunch that within a very short period of time, technology that allows for the places where cars are, even in and out of HOT lanes and so on, will be built into cars by the manufacturer, much as we see with satellite radio today. And so these are the kinds of questions that our staff are now going to go forward, if City Council says yes, to explore and to come back with a report sometime next year that starts to answer those questions and starts to put a process in place to move forward to actually implement this and to decide exactly how that will be done.
Building on David's question, can you be a little more specific about when you decided tolls was the thing? We haven't heard this publicly. And what specifically was it that triggered your mind that this, as opposed to parking levy or hydro sale or something else?
Well, as we looked at the different options, the parking levy clearly was so cumbersome and so difficult to administer and was going to be so subject to people coming forward and saying, I want to be exempt and I shouldn't be a part of this and so on. And it also had an element of unfairness in it, in that it applied to a certain categories of businesses that happen happen to have parking spaces and not others. And similarly, when you looked at the sale of all or part of Toronto Hydro, when you found that there was a better way to actually meet the needs of that corporation without giving up equity and without sacrificing some of the dividend, in fact, this way may allow us to increase the dividend, it became evident that we should look elsewhere for the kind of long-term revenue stream that we needed other than a property tax. And I think my position on property taxes is very well known. And again, I'll restate why. The property tax is the biggest single check people write to the City of Toronto each and every year. And that includes a lot of seniors who are on fixed incomes and are very anxious to stay in their homes. It includes a lot of young people who are people that have just made that calculation as to how they can afford a home in the advent of rising prices, and a lot of other people in between, young and old. And I have felt before, I've been consistent on this, and I feel now that the property tax is not the way in any event to raise billions of dollars for transit projects and things of that nature. And so as I did this analysis and then saw the city report, and the city report had one thing in it that also caught my attention, I will tell you. And that is that just to do the work that has to be done on the Gardiner Expressway, because it's been left to the point where it is at the end, the very end of its useful life, and the Parkway is going to involve considerable refurbishment over the next 25 years as well. The total of those two pieces of work alone are in the billions of dollars. And I thought that it was fair to ask people to contribute to the cost of building what will amount to virtually new roads in the case of the Gardiner, and for the first time to acknowledge the fact that 40% of the people who use those roads are from outside of the City of Toronto, have never and do not pay any of the cost of building and keeping them up, and I think that fairness dictates that they should begin to do so in a modest way. And so that was what pushed me to the conclusion that I reached.
And also the capital levy, I didn't hear anything about that in your speech. That's recommended in the report, a capital levy kicking in around the same time as the road tolls at 5%.
Well, first of all, with respect to the city report, there are a lot of things in the city report that I said I wasn't going to do, and I haven't even had time to kind of go through in this speech or standing here and list them all one by one. I indicated a couple of things I was going to do by way of tax reform. I indicated a couple of things I wasn't going to do, a tax levy, a parking tax levy, and a sale of all or part of Toronto Hydro. And with respect to all the others, I guess we'll have to have time to fully absorb that report. I just saw it for the first time like 24 hours ago. And so I will just say to you that there are lots of things in there that I haven't had time to digest as yet. With respect to the half-point city building levy that I did announce a year or so ago, I stand by that. I think that is a reasonable, modest contribution that property taxpayers can make to beginning to finance the city building efforts in the Toronto Transit Infrastructure Fund. And it was built upon something put in place by the previous mayor, Rob Ford, who put in place a half-a-point levy to build a subway. And in this case, I indicated that the half-a-point levy would be continued for an additional period of time to do the same thing, which is to build transit. I think it was fair in the first instance. I think it's fair in the second instance, and I stand behind it. And I did mention it in the speech. I just didn't draw particular attention to it, other than saying that would be money that would be in this fund that will be independently audited, and it will be added to by the proceeds of the road tolls if they're approved.
Mayor Tory, you said it's only going to cost $2. Is it $2 a day? Is it $2 from York Mills to Richmond, $2 from the 427 to Yonge? And like, what is the real cost for drivers? And secondly, is it going to be people living outside the city paying the toll, or is it going to be everyone that is included living in the city?
Well, I think I gave an example of $2, which was $2 each way that you would, use the expressways in question. I will only say to you that that was just for example, because I used it as an example to say if you charged a toll of $2, it would produce roughly this much money. You'll notice in reading the report that it suggests a whole range of options, some of them lower than $2. Some of them higher than $2. I'm not going to stand here today and say that either that it's my decision alone to pick a number, or that I want to do so without the expert advice of our staff. And now they've written a report that contains a range of options. They will go away and they will come back to the City Council, which ultimately has the final say on this. And we will have to make a decision on the basis of what is fair for people and what will produce the funds, not all of them obviously, to address the $33 billion, but to make a substantial dent in that so that we can move ahead and build transit and relieve traffic. With respect to the question of 905 and 416, the report that is in front of us that prompted me to speak today contemplates that it would be paid by both people in the 416 and in the 905, and I think the important thing to note there is that we will finally have an instance here, and I say this in no way that is meant to be provocative, it is just a way that represents common sense and fairness. We will finally have at least one mechanism pursuant to which the people who use services paid for by the taxpayers of the City of Toronto will make a small contribution to the costs related to those services, and I think that's very fair.
When do you want the toll to be in place? Before the end of this term?
Oh, I don't think it's going to be practical given first the technical details that we now have to get advice on from our staff, and then the procurement process that you have to go through, both a complicated procurement process in terms of my desire to see the most advanced technology in the world procured, but also the time it takes because of the rules that relate to how we do procurement. So I think that the report indicates, I believe, that the earliest one could look at having anything in place would be around 2019. I'm just quoting what they said, but we're obviously going to try and do it as quickly as possible because, as I said, I think the sooner we start to collect the funds and put it into this transit and infrastructure fund, the sooner we'll be able to know that we're starting to accumulate what is a very large sum of money needed to build transit and fix traffic. And so we'll do it carefully, we'll do it properly, but we'll do it as quickly as we can. And of course, all of this is preceded by a debate that will take place at the City Council and what I hope will be the anticipated approval.
One, can you tell us about any approaches from the province? My understanding is they do have to prove it in some way, how receptive they've been. And two, can you elaborate on, we're living in this political populism moment. This puts a target on your back, doesn't it, for the next election? How do you respond to this?
I think in this job I don't like to use the expression you did, but I think in this job you're accountable every day. There are going to be people who agree and disagree with you, and as I said earlier on, I would certainly invite those who are opposed to the option that I've put forward to stand up and say how they're going to build the transit and how they're going to pay for it, because to me, I don't hear any argument from the people at all about the need to build the transit and about the need to address the housing issue and a number of other things that I mentioned, including the port lands and the senior citizens' long-term care. And so I would say that I've come forward now with one more element of my plan. I've talked about modernizing government. I've talked about a 15-year transit plan instead of doing one project at a time. I've talked about some different elements of how to pay for it, both the initial modest half-point levy and now road tolls, and I've indicated some of the choices that I didn't accept and why not. And I think that people will admire the honesty of that. I think they will admire the forthright and straightforwardness of it, and agree with me that it is fine to have a plan. It's fine to have a $33 billion list of projects you've approved over decades of the City Council, but it's not fine to not proceed with those and not do anything about most of those because you haven't spelled out how you're going to pay for them. And I think that that is the kind of leadership people expect. I came to office with a plan to try and make sure this city caught up. We had no trouble in previous times approving the condo towers and the office towers, and they're a sign of confidence in this city. But we somehow missed, and by we I mean my predecessors, somehow missed the obligation that you have to do all the things that go with that growth, as positive as it is, starting most particularly with transit and traffic, but going through housing and some of the other services. And I think now the day of reckoning is at hand. And with the city experiencing the kind of growth we know it's going to experience going forward, not based on my forecast, but everybody else's, I think not to act, not to spell out how you'd pay for it, and not to get on with building would be irresponsible, and I just don't intend to be seen as that kind of a mayor.
So, Mayor, would you support a flat rate, or would you support...
I'm sorry, I just didn't hear the first part.
Would you support a flat rate with this toll, or would you support a length of travel with this toll?
You know what, again, I'm not going to get into that. I mean, I gave as an example, which perhaps indicates some small indication that I think a flat rate is simpler for people to understand and so on, but that was also the kind of example that was given, although they said in the report that you could do it on the basis of miles traveled. I sort of think I have a sort of an incoming introductory kind of mild preference for a flat rate, but again, this is the kind of advice we have to get based on how you can administer it, how the technology will work, what kind of money it will produce, and various other consequences, and that's the advice that I would hope, subject to City Council moving forward, we will get from our staff now, and that will then be considered, I hope, sometime in the new year. C'est un sujet très technique, mais je essaie de parler un peu de français.
Pourquoi vous pensez que les péages de tolls,
Right.
pourquoi vous pensez que c'est la meilleure solution pour payer pour tous ces projets?
C'est une solution, dans mon opinion, que c'est juste pour tous les citoyens. C'est les citoyens qui utilisaient les rues, Don Valley Parkway et Gardiner, payent qu'est-ce que c'est le mot?
Le péage?
Paye les péages. Et à moi, c'est juste. Et aussi, les citoyens qui n'habitent pas dans la ville de Toronto payent aussi. Et si les citoyens des autres villes conduisent sur les rues dans Valley Parkway et Gardiner, c'est juste pour les mêmes citoyens de payer aussi des citoyens de Toronto.
Mayor Tory, can you just go back to the question of the province and of the
That's bad French, eh? Sorry about that.
Just going back to the question about